Well, hi everybody. Welcome back. We're on to Unit 6, and we're going to start to get into less the administrative side and more the people side. We'll start with eyewitnesses and a discussion of eyewitnesses, and then which is going to be a short lecture from me this week because Dr. Peterson took up 15 minutes of your time, and we're trying to balance things out, right? But then we'll move on to interviews coming up here. And so the eyewitness stuff really helps you in framing your interviews. So I'd like to do this unit first. I will tell you that I'm going to apologize ahead of time. You may hear a little bit of banging in the background. One of my neighbors is working on some kind of a project, and it is such a beautiful day in Michigan, the day I'm recording your lecture. It's about 65 degrees and sunny, and I just cannot bring myself to sit inside of my office. And if you are having such a great weather day in Pennsylvania, wherever you may happen to be, I suggest you get outside to do this too. So, what's the commercial say? Sorry, not sorry. I am sorry if the noise, does pop up occasionally in this lecture, but not sorry that I'm sitting outside on a gorgeous day, and you should try to do the same. So you hear the term witness used, quite a bit. We're all kind of familiar with it. We see it on TV, or if we've had any reason to be in a court system for any good reason, bad reason, whatever it happens to be, we've heard the term witness. And according to the Department of Justice, a witness is a person who saw or heard the crime take place or may have important information about the crime or the defendant. Now, if you look at that, it really is different than what classically we think of as a witness, right? It really broadens out with that last part about having information or may have important information about the crime. So that includes eyewitnesses, right, in the classic sense, somebody who saw it happen, right? If I decide to murder my neighbor who's going crazy with the hammer over there, right, and another neighbor is standing there watching me do it, we have an eyewitness. But that's not the only type of witness, right? And other principles that can help you prove or disprove things are considered witnesses. So we really have to talk about an eyewitness versus a witness to understand where both have their place in our investigation. So a witness may not have seen a thing. They might not have been around at the time of the event in question. So, why does this matter? So let's take a witness like in a fraud case, right? Some of you have fraud backgrounds or education. If there's a fraud case going on, I am going to go back to a forensic accountant, and I'm going to say, look at the books and, tell me, where the money bled out, right? From a non-technical term, right? Where's the hole in the boat? And they become a witness of mine. If we were to go to court on that particular fraud, they would be called, and they would be called a witness. Even though they didn't see a thing, they did not see the person go in and take the money out. They did not, they just know that in the accounts there was $100,000, and now, through some form of magic criminal activity, we see there is only $90,000 there. They did not see the person do it, make a ledger change, put the, divert the cash or funds into a different account. They simply are witness that things are not as they should be, in that financial accounting. So why does this matter to you? And when we get to interviews, it matters because you can say that you have a witness in an interview. You can say, Brian, I have a witness that puts you, in the neighbor's yard at the time he was killed. And that may be true. It could very well be that one person in a house in between myself and my neighbor watched me walk by, and another neighbor up past the neighbor's house on the same street did not see me walk by, and both of them were in their yard. I now know that Brian walked by and walked into the zone of the murder, right? So I have a witness. I have no one that has seen it, but I can honestly say in an interview, I have a witness that puts you there. That is not untrue. Is it misleading? I don't think so. Because again, I didn't say I have a witness who saw you murder the neighbor. I have a witness who can put you in the crime scene, in the zone of the crime. The witness does not have to be someone who saw the matter. A witness is anyone who can add to your case. And therefore, when you get to your who, what, when, why, how, the person who pulls an access control record, perhaps, right? It's a corporate investigation, and you need to know whether I was in the location at a certain time and there's badge access. The person you asked to pull that report is indeed a witness. They may have to testify that they indeed pulled the report, they know how to pull the report, they did it accurately, and this was the result. So don't think of witnesses as people who saw something. Think of anyone who adds to your understanding of a matter as a witness. That's really important for that delineation. Because when we talk about eyewitnesses, they are simply different because they indeed are the ones who saw something. Now that we know that an eyewitness saw something, now it's what did they see? And we've all, I go back to the movies and TV because we get a lot of our perceptions about how things are by the media we absorb. And an eyewitness, there's always that eyewitness as the reason that people take pleas, right? I didn't do this. You got nothing on me. I'm going to fight this. I have an eyewitness. Okay, what's your offer, right? We've seen it 100 times. Or the person on the stand that say, sir, can you identify the person who indeed, thrust the knife into the neighbor's back? And the guy points and, gives you that dirty look and says, there he is right there. Let the record reflect that the witness has indicated the defendant, right? We've all seen that on TV. But is that reality? Is it reality that an eyewitness puts everything else to shame as far as evidence and is the definitive end to a case if there's an eyewitness? Well, we started to look at our own attention spans, and we started to look at things like memory contamination. And now I think we have a better understanding that although eyewitnesses are not bad, in fact, they are very good to have, they are not the do-all and end-all of an investigation, and you can't just stop because you have an eyewitness. So it takes us to selective attention. The selective attention exercises, I believe there are 4 or 5 of them in this week. How did you do? Well, if you were already looking for something, you knew there was going to be a trick, you probably saw something happen that shouldn't have happened. You were trying to be hyper observant, right? And let's face it, the average person who witnesses a anomaly, a crime, a breach of regulation or rule, isn't set up and waiting for that to happen to catch it. They're not on a surveillance, right? They normally happen upon it. It happens around them. It happens to them rather than them being prepared to witness it. And when we listen to Dr. Peterson, who is a definite expert in this field, he's a professor at the University of Toronto, written several books about politics and things, right? He kind of get off track a little bit on some of this stuff, and just from his core work, but he is the guy, right? And I really enjoy that 15-minute snippet of him because I think it really gives you the facts on why our brains work the way they do. But really what he says is we can't take in everything. Our brains and our eyesight and our anatomy is not set up to do that. And that we really concentrate on what is most important to our goal. And let me just go over that because it's really important that you understand that. Every one of us that drives, and I would venture to say that most people in this course have a driver's license, or even if you don't, you've certainly ridden public transportation, has at some point in our driving career, be it long or short, passed by an accident scene. Think about it on the freeway, somebody collides with somebody else, and it's in the median, and there's lots of lights, and there's ambulances and fire trucks and police cars, and traffic is moving at a snail's pace. And you drive by going very slow, bumper to bumper traffic going by, and you glance over and you look because, look, let's face it, we all look at the train wreck, we all look at the accident, right? You can't not look. Some jurisdictions have bought these giant screens they put up around fatalities so the people don't look. It's a respect thing, but frankly, we all try to look, even when those things are up, we try to look around them. It's just how we're wired. But 30 minutes later, if I were to ask you the make, model, or color of any of those vehicles involved, unless one of them was a pink tractor trailer, right, you're probably not going to know. You stopped and you looked at that accident scene, but you won't be able to remember the make, model, and color of those vehicles. It just doesn't happen, right? You don't say, wow, there's a bad accident on the highway, a blue Honda Civic did this or did that. You're not looking at that. You're looking for something different. You're looking for carnage, maybe. Who knows what you're looking for? But your goal was to safely drive by the accident, so you're concentrating back and forth between not running into the vehicle in front of you, which is moving at a snail's pace and you're only 5 feet off his bumper, and trying to get a good look at that accident. You're not really concentrating on what were the make and model, even though you stared at that, right? Even if you sat there, you stared at it, you still wouldn't be able to tell me the make and model of those vehicles, I'll bet you a week's pay on it. So his research suggests that our observation is based on context, instruction, and goals. In the case of the accident, you don't have a instruction, but your own internal instruction was take a look and see what's going on over there, right? Context is confusion, and the context is I'm driving, so my most important thing to do is to stay on the road, and my goal is to get past the accident and get back, on the road and go wherever I was going. None of those things have anything to do with the make and model of the car, so therefore, even though you saw it, and in a normal context, if I told you when you go by that accident, tell me what make and model that is, you'd go get it, so it's possible. In your context, in the instruction that you've given yourself and in your goals, that's not important. And these anomalies, these differences, these pieces of information get processed one at a time. Think about cell phone blindness. I love this because, as you walk across campus, and I asked you, what did you do today? And you might tell me that I walked from Old Main to Weisenfluh to get something to eat at lunchtime. And it was about 10 minutes to 12, and I got over there about 12 o'clock. And I was talking to my mom on the cell phone. Okay, great. How many people did you pass? Did you pass anyone wearing a Penguins baseball cap? If I asked you those things ahead of time, you would be looking out for those things, and you would see those things. But because you're really talking about your mom, I can ask you questions about, what did you tell mom? Well, I thanked her for the care package she sent and asked her if next time she might throw a $20 bill or two in there, because that's always nice in a care package from home, right? You may remember those things because that was your goal. Your goal was to get from point A to point B, and walking you did that, and your concentration, your context was you were on the phone. So we can't concentrate on everything, and neither can witnesses. And we jam ourselves up when we expect that they can. So knowing this stuff, we need to put it in the context of how we're going to talk to these witnesses, these potential eyewitnesses in this case, right? A type of witness, an eyewitness. And you might just say, what did you see, right? But what other questions? We always ask, did you see anything unusual that day, right? But how do we know that there's a usual? Right? If I'm going to walking down in front of my home, I walk in front of my home all the time, and if something is amiss. In fact, a couple of weeks back, I'm walking down, and my wife has beautiful roses in front of the house that she's taken a lot of time to plant. I was coming down the road, and I'm looking, and I don't see any roses. I noticed it right away because there's usually just, a burst of color in front of the house, and there was no burst of color. There were a few colors, but not nearly what it was before. When I got closer, I found out that the white-tailed deer that I have been feeding in the backyard, throwing apples off my second-story deck to them, and they're eating them like they're a zoo animal, right? They wait for me to throw them, and they walk up to get them. Had also feasted on her roses, right? My usual was that there's a burst of color when I walk down the street. I can see it in front of my house. That's the usual. The unusual was it was gone. But let's just say that I was just anybody else walking down the street, and I was doing it for the first time. Was anything unusual? Absolutely not. There were some flowers. There was no difference. So we have to understand the person's context and their understanding of what's usual, right? So what can we do really to account for selective attention, right? There's a couple things you can do in an interview and as an investigator to account for that and to understand that you need to make allowances for it. Now that you understand that selective attention is really what we're concentrating on and what our usual is. So as a corporate investigator in an interview, when talking to potential eyewitnesses, there are 3 things that I found to be very helpful and some things to avoid. So when you're asking questions, you should not prompt people beyond what they've already told you, right? If I asked, if I was an investigator and said, Brian, you were walking down the street and What did you see? Well, I was coming down the street as I normally do. There's a bit of a grade there. I can see the front yard from a little ways away. There's always these beautiful colors, and I didn't see the colors, and that made me think, wow, what's wrong with the roses? Are they dying? Should I be asking about, well, how about the neighbor's yard? Do they have roses? Those things? That's really not indicative of anything that we need to know. And you're prompting me to say, oh, well, yeah, now that I think about it, I think the roses in front of my neighbor's houses, yeah, I think they have some too. Yeah, they could have been eaten by the deer too. I have no idea. I did not notice that. You're basically prompting me into saying something that I have no confidence in. So you can ask clarifying questions. What direction were you coming from? So then you can understand if you return and walk down the street, you can tell that there is a bit of a grade, so I can see the front yard from quite some distance. And there was that much color that I would have noticed it from there, right? That's a clarifying question. But a probative one where you're really trying to get me to remember something that isn't there is not fruitful. And in fact, it can make for conjecture, where I said, yeah, I think the neighbors had some roses, and now I think about it, I think theirs are probably eaten too. Now you're taking it as fact that, the deer ate all the roses, right? Which may not be true, because I'm not really clear, because you really just prompted something that I wasn't able to really speak of and I didn't bring up. So stick to what they tell you. You can ask clarifying questions, but don't probe beyond what they are reasonably telling you they saw. Second, you want to understand what their normal routine is in that time and place, right? Do you normally walk that direction? Well, no, I normally come the other direction. Well, maybe those roses got eaten 3 days ago, right? Maybe that it wasn't something that happened just this morning, because you usually go the other direction and you wouldn't see it from that angle. You want to understand what their normal is so that you can understand how well their perception of change was, right? How well do they know the area? You can't ask someone if they saw anything unusual if they don't know what usual is. The first time I came to the Slippery Rock campus, I pictured it differently. Now, actually, I was really impressed with what I saw. Here in Michigan, our state schools tend to be very institutional looking, right? There aren't as many trees planted at some of them. Sure, University of Michigan and Michigan State being the big money makers, if you will, in the state for education. They have very nice campuses, although Michigan State is much nicer than Michigan's, I will tell you, having been on both campuses extensively. But I was very kind of surprised at how well the campus was maintained and how nice it looked, and just the feel of the campus. I would have had no reference point until I went there. So if you ask me, was there anything unusual? I said, well, yeah, it's really well kept. Well, that's not unusual. The campus is well kept. You have, the opportunity to study at a place that's actually very well maintained and well kept. That's not unusual. To me, it was unusual because I had a perception. So really try to understand what the person's frame of reference is. And then most important, when you have an eyewitness, maybe you have more than one, piece together their accounts. Okay? I was walking down the street and I noticed that the roses were gone in the front of my house. We talked to another neighbor who was also walking that day, and they said, yeah, I noticed they were gone in front of the judge's house across the street, but not in front of Brian's house. I really didn't notice that. Well, now you have two houses, right? We're trying to catch and, pin that one deer that's eating the roses and put him in jail, right? But you understand that we're not trying to get others to discount what I said, but we're trying to get a fuller picture of the scene by talking to eyewitnesses about what they may have seen. And in your account, you can say, Brian noticed that the roses in front of his house were damaged. And Mrs. Jones noticed that the roses in front of the judge's house were also damaged. So now we have two occurrences. Don't try to prompt one witness with the other's account, but piece them together afterwards when you look at your interviews. Which really leads us to memory contamination. And I find those articles to be very valuable as well. And Wickstead and Mickles talk about the idea that memory is much like DNA, that it can be contaminated, that if you don't protect your crime scene, And your evidence, after it's collected, it can be contaminated and thus become relatively useless. And memory can do the same thing, right? If you don't protect someone's memory from outside influences, then it becomes contaminated. Think about a story that you may have told, they're referred to war stories for those of us who have been in the military, even when there are stories about the business and other things. And you tell that story, and if you really go back and think about it, you say, well, it wasn't exactly that way, right? We sometimes stretch the truth a bit when we tell stories. I think that's a human nature thing. We don't lie. We try not to lie anyway. But, sometimes things get bigger. Fish stories, right? Everybody caught a fish, biggest fish you ever caught. And if everybody tells us the biggest fish they ever caught, I would probably, take about 3 or 4 inches off that fish because everybody lies about the size of that fish. Okay? And when they tell the story, the fish tends to get bigger, right? When somebody tells that fishing story about they had this fish on the line, they were trying to pull him in the boat, and they finally got him in, and he was an 18-inch bass. Great. That 18-inch bass, a year from now, telling that story, became 21 inches, and by the time the guy dies, he pulled Moby Dick into the boat, one-handed, hit him with a baseball bat, and the entire nation ate for a week. Okay? If you over-explain a story, it becomes the truth. It becomes the perception of truth in the person who tells the story. If you tell somebody to give their account of something, they will, over time, pick up little things from the questions people ask, from the probative questions, right? And start to change the story. Brian, tell us about when you went in the house after you went for your walk. Okay, I went in and I stopped in the sunroom and I talked to my wife for a minute. Well, you took your coat off and hung it up, right? Oh yeah, I took my coat off. Now, I took my coat off, and like any, man who wants to get yelled at by his wife, I didn't hang it up properly. I threw it on the back of a counter stool in the kitchen, and then had a conversation with my wife in the sunroom, to which she ended the conversation, "Did you hang up your coat?" And I said, "Well, yeah." Then I went and grabbed it real quick and hung it up. But when I retell that story, it is very likely over time I will say, I walked in the house and I hung up my coat and I went and talked to my wife in the sunroom. That is not what happened. And there's actually a whole part of research. I was in a course with a gentleman who did statement analysis from the Mossad, Israeli special police, and he could take a written statement. He would ask you, tell me everything you did from the time you woke up in your hotel room this morning till you got to this class. And you would write it out, and he would look at everybody's statement, and he would say, okay, this isn't accurate. Something else happened here. Or did you really do it that way, or did you do it a different way? And in every case, he was right. It's actually a science. Maybe it's an art form. I don't know. But when you tell a story, you seldom tell it exactly as it happened. And if someone prods you with something to try to, tell you that, well, did you hung up your coat? Oh, yeah, I did that, right? It's a small thing, but you say it. But it tends to, over time, start to change the story. There'll be suggested events. It prompts you with information that's not in your memory, but you're going to accept it as part of your story as time goes on. Time absolutely ruins the memory. There's no question about it. The other night for dinner, my wife made some delicious pork chops on the grill. Oh my God, they were fantastic. But when one of my workmates and I were talking about food, which I don't know why we talk so much about food, but we do. He was talking about Peruvian chicken that he gets from someplace in North Carolina, because that's where he lives. And I said, yeah, we'll probably do something on the grill tonight. I forget what we had last night. He said, you forgot what you had for dinner? I said, yeah, let me think about it. Well, I wasn't forgetting about them while I was eating those pork chops, because they were just phenomenal, and I like to eat. But over time, I just forgot. It wasn't as important to me. So time, memory fades with time, and we know that. Then there's also the concept of groupthink. And that's something that you really have to guard against when it comes to memory contamination. If you and I start to discuss something, we will start to think alike on that over time, especially in big group. People tend to yield a little bit to the big group. So if there were 5 neighbors, and every one of them said that I walked down the street and I didn't notice anything different at Brian's house. But I walked down and I noticed that those roses were gone, right? The color wasn't right. If I'm sitting in that group of 5 neighbors and we're discussing this matter, over time I will say, well, maybe it maybe they were that way the day before. I guess I really didn't notice, and I start to waver because we start to think like the group. Eventually, it's really what a jury does, quite frankly. It's a scary thing about jury rooms where people start to think alike. It's not just taking someone else's suggestion and I say, oh, I never thought about that. That's a good point. It's not just a discussion. It is a matter of we start to think alike when we're in a group. And it's something that, as an investigator, you have to be very concerned with. So just like with the selective attention, there are ways as an investigator we can help guard against contamination of memory. We can't prevent it. We know that. But if we keep witnesses separated, and in a workplace, that's very hard to do. I'm going to interview someone who may have been an eyewitness to something, and then I'm going to interview 3 more people. And in most cases, there is a connection between those 3 people, right? Something happened in their department, and they all work in the same department. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been in that area to see it, right? There's always some connection between witnesses, unless it's rare that there's not, right? They all live in a certain area. They all have a certain routine. They've seen each other before. And you need to keep them separated in so much as you can. But if they all go back to work in the same room, right? I just did a case where I had someone do something, and there were 4 people in the room, one of them my subject, and I talked to the other 3. And when I'm done talking to them, they're going back to work, and they're going back into a 10 by 10 room to work. It's a very small operating suite, and that's where they're going. How do I keep them separate? Well, the way I keep them separate is by policy. You need to have a policy that says that you will cooperate in an investigation, for one, and number 2, you will not discuss investigative matters except with the investigator. So in many companies, their compliance program covers that. There is a policy that says if you have a problem, if you want to be a whistleblower of sorts, you can come forward and you don't have to worry about retaliation. At the same time, you are not to talk to others about what we talk about in an HR, security, or other compliance-related functional meeting, right? Doesn't mean we're trying to put a gag order on people. We're just trying to make sure that those people don't get back in that room and start talking about this. It's just like a jury talking about the case when they're not in the jury room. It's forbidden by law. In this case, it's not forbidden by law. You have to have a policy that helps you so that you can keep people's memories from being contaminated by each other. Understand that every repetition of the story solidifies the memory. Right? So I walked in the house, accurately walked in the house, took off my coat, put it on the back of that stool, and went and talked to my wife. To my story being, I walked in the house, hung up my coat, and went and talked to my wife. Does it matter in the scheme of this particular investigation? Probably not. But it might. It might be used to impugn a witness at some point to say, well, they don't have the right memory because that's not what happened. So what else did they not remember? Right? So having a person tell their story too many times will get them into a pattern that each little nuance starts to change the story slightly. And eventually, instead of that 18-inch fish, you have that Moby Dick in the boat, right? So you got to make sure that you don't ask them to tell the story too many times. One way to do that is to get a written statement the first time. When you get their account of it, you repeat it back to them verbatim. Okay, I was walking down the street, and I noticed that the roses weren't there. So you were coming down the street, and there was a difference there you saw, right? The roses weren't there. That's correct. Write that down. Have them take notes in the interview. You're taking notes. Why shouldn't they? Ask them to take notes. And in the end, ask them clarifying questions on anything in their notes that isn't clear, and they can write it right on the same piece of paper. Then have them sign that as a written statement. In that case, you have the freshest and best version of their story without any undue influence or contamination of their memory. Okay? In your interviews, don't introduce the accounts of others. That's already done. So if I've interviewed one person and they tell me they walked down the hill and they didn't notice anything different about anybody's front yard, and then I interview Brian, and Brian says I walked down the street and I looked in the front yard and I noticed the roses were not there. The color wasn't there that's normally there. It's not that big burst of color. Thought something was wrong. If I say to Brian, well, I talked to your neighbor and they walked down the street and they didn't notice any difference. I've planted doubt, and I start to test my memory, and I start to doubt my own memory. And I will change my story slightly very often in those cases. So when I say, well, I spoke with Jane and she said the man was wearing a hat. Can you confirm that? Well, I have two choices here. I mean, I can either say, no, I recall the guy didn't wear a hat, or if Jane says so, then it's probably true. I know Jane. Jane works with me. She's really smart and she's always a stickler for detail. So yeah, the guy was wearing a hat because Jane said so. So therefore, that's my testimony too. That makes for very bad evidence, because maybe Jane saw a man in a hat and you saw another man without a hat, and maybe both of them are responsible for whatever it is you're investigating. But you have planted the seed that Jane said the man was wearing a hat, so therefore if I think Jane is accurate, then therefore the hat is accurate, and I will acquiesce to that and say the hat is accurate. So to keep memory from being contaminated, we keep witnesses separated, right, as much as we can. We tell them, don't discuss this amongst yourselves. If anybody asks to discuss it, refer them back to me as the investigator, and I will ask them not to discuss it, right? This is a confidential investigation. We don't ask them the story too many times. We don't ask them, okay, tell my story. Okay, great, now bring in our partner. Can you tell him what you just told me? And then we bring in the boss. We say, can you repeat that back to him? Every time the story will go a little sideways, and then you'll be asking clarifying questions. But didn't you tell me this? It just blows the whole thing up. Get that written statement after the first interview. Everything you told me, I just need you to write down. Take the notes as we go along. And in fact, when they say something of note, say, okay, go ahead and write that down so that we don't forget that. Like they're taking the notes for the meeting. And in the end, have them sign it, because that is what they told you. And that becomes your freshest and best version. And then never introduce, when I spoke to somebody else, they said something different. Unless you're talking to a subject, and we'll get to that, right? If it's the person that you know that you're setting your sights on and you've got enough evidence, you've gone through your entire investigative plan, and this is where it points, then you might say, well, I have someone who said this, different than what you said. Can you explain that? Right? That's a tactic for a subject. But when you're just dealing with potential eyewitnesses, never introduce what somebody else said, because it will taint the eyewitness account of the person you're actually interviewing. So as we're starting to wind down, because I told you this would be a little shorter because Dr. Peterson has 15 minutes and you did have some videos and a little bit of reading to do. When it comes to eyewitness accounts, in our discussion, what I'd like you to talk about is your personal results on those selective awareness exercises, right? The Hershey's Kiss under the cup, there were several of them there, right? I want you to just tell us, how you did, right? Be honest. I will tell you that I was mine was just abysmal. There's one there that's in Dr. Peterson's video that he inserts in the middle of it. That's a classic that everybody, I can't imagine that half the class has not seen that one before. And the first time I saw it, I totally missed the most obvious thing that happens in that video. I won't steal it from you. If you haven't seen it, you probably should have by now. In fact, you have probably done the reading first and the test first. So the gorilla. I missed the gorilla. And quite frankly, I saw it twice and still missed the gorilla walking through. Tell us about your experience with one or more of those tests and what you may have missed, and whether that, were you surprised that you missed that? I mean, just tell us about your experience. What does Dr. Peterson's explanation tell you about eyewitnesses? Well, he's not telling you that they lie, that they're unreliable in the sense that they are unreliable as people. But maybe he's telling you something about the reliability of what they're telling you, right? When you read the Scientific American article on memory contamination, what might you do to guard against or understand how pure an account of an incident might be, right? Understanding what you know about memory contamination, what are some of the things you might do, okay? And then finally, and the most important thing here, knowing what you know about eyewitnesses. It is very easy when an eyewitness comes up in an investigation to say, well, I think I have something missing out of the storeroom. I have the batteries. Let's go back to our battery example, right? Batteries are missing out of the storeroom, and one of your witnesses says, I saw Brian steal those batteries. Well, in a perfect world, we'd be able to say, oh, game over. But is it really game over? Knowing what you know about witness and witness reliability now, should you stop an investigation and not go through and do the rest of the who, what, when, where, how, why? Because you have an eyewitness and you pretty much have a lock, and, once you've got an eyewitness, then, you know what happened, right? Or do you? And so those are the things you're going to discuss in the discussion this week. I expect it to be rather robust. because I think this is fun stuff, and I hope that you will join in and make it so. Deliverables real quick before we get out of here. The reading and the videos, right? Mostly videos, a little bit of reading. You've done that, hopefully, before you came to the lecture. You did the lecture now. We're done, so good deal. Got a discussion to do. Same rules as before on discussion. 250 words on initial, 100 on responses. Initial is due Thursday, 5 p.m. I will try to put that in the calendar, but your initial is due Thursday at 5 p.m. If it is not submitted Thursday by 5 p.m. and I have not heard from you before 5 p.m. on Thursday about why, there will be no makeups. So please get it in on time. And then your responses are due by the close of the week, Sunday, 11:59 p.m. as always. So same rules as past deliverables and discussions, rather. And with that, if you have anything that you need to talk to me about, call, write, text. I have heard from several of you. Others I have heard nothing from, and I'm assuming things go well. But I do want some feedback from people. So, don't be afraid to send me notes saying, hey, it's going okay, but I wish we would do more of this, or I was expecting that. I really do want to hear about how to improve my courses. So please don't wait till the last minute and the course evaluation. I don't try to influence my scores in the end, but if I can make something better now, please let me know. Again, Thursday, due date on the initial post. Don't forget. Everybody have a great week, and we will talk to you in the next lecture.